Thank you very much, Paul, and my colleagues around the room and the group of you here who I haven't met, but I've been getting pinged and texted and everything else since this started, and apparently you guys are amazing. So I'm really pleased to be here. I want to go through a number of different things today. I've actually got my phone out about so I can keep on time. I am going to go a little bit less than an hour, but I'm going to be telling a lot of stories. No PowerPoint though. So, yes? Better? Hold it up. I'm sorry. So I had kept putting off what the title of this lecture was because I kept tweaking it. But let me tell you now, actually, what the title of the lecture is, other than the fact that it's the Bailey Morris-Eck lecture. The title is, and of course there's a colon in the middle of it because academics can't give lectures without having colons. It's called The Ember of Democracy: Storytelling, Empathy, and Responsibility. So, you know, we face challenges that are monumental. We're hurting, and we're hurt. I know I could go around the room and sit and talk to each one of you, and you could tell me about troubles at home, in your communities, in your regions, where some kind of change is needed. So to give just a short list, we're all too close to conflicts in places such as Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Palestine, Venezuela, Hong Kong, South Sudan, Haiti, Mexico. I know there's folks in the room here from Mexico, and I just learned myself, kind of embarrassing, that the Mexican drug war actually had the highest death toll of any quote-unquote war in the world in 2020, with over 50,000 deaths. But it's not considered a major war because most of those deaths are murders. Then there's climate change, of course, and pandemics, of course. But today, as I just said in my title, I want to talk about democracy, which may have felt like an abstraction to most of us in the past, but I'm guessing that almost all of you have been sort of brought up short by what we probably should be calling the crisis of democracy. So, okay, the past several years have seen economic, social, geopolitical upheavals, not just in new democracies, but in established ones, right? Austria, the United States, the UK, so forth. Countries that have been rather too self-assured about the strength of their institutions. Populists and authoritarians around the globe have had remarkable success in elections. Perhaps not coincidentally, definitely not coincidentally, as civil liberties and other democratic norms and values have crumbled. In the United States, for example, and I'm an American who grew up in Europe, but at the moment, and forgive me, I am going to be talking a fair amount, but not exclusively about the United States today. Disinformation has been a core part of the campaigns waged by at least 27 state governments. In the United States, we have 50 states. 27, so more than half state governments, to undermine Black Americans' access to voting. Over these past 2 years of the COVID era, weaknesses in the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches of government across the globe have been revealed. And many media platforms, assumed to be messy, but still valued platforms, giving some people a voice, social media, talk radio, cable news, have themselves become causal in the crisis of democracy. So, what should we, the people, do? Well, I've got some ideas. But let me interrupt myself to talk just for a minute or two about this lectureship. So the Bailey Morris-Eck lecture at the Salzburg Global Seminar. As Paul introduced, it's always a joy for me to be at the Salzburg Academy and frankly to be here at the Schloss and here in Salzburg. My husband, Stephen Salyer, who has been the CEO and president of the Salzburg Global Seminar for 17 years, steps down this coming weekend. And he would be here today if he didn't just get COVID. He and I founded the Academy however many years ago, Paul? A fair number. 15, 18, whatever. It's a tremendous honor for me to be asked to deliver this lectureship, not least because I knew Bailey, and I want to live up to her standards and frankly to our friendship. You've already heard some of what she accomplished in her too short life. She had a long life, but she was one of those people who you hoped would live forever. But let me say a few sentences behind those star turns of hers as being a leading journalist, a player in political capitals, particularly in London and Washington, and elsewhere as a reporter and consultant. She was fearless. As Paul said, she was petite, but she was fearless, and she made her triumphs look effortless. But they weren't. Bailey was born Kathy Bailey Urban. She was born in the middle of World War II, and everyone called her Kathy growing up. But she felt she had to claim her androgynous middle name, Bailey, because when she became a journalist, women were too rarely listened to. As Bailey, she had a voice that could be and was heard. Bailey was strong, she was fiercely intelligent, unstoppably curious, and a collector of ideas. She was a brilliant journalistic translator of some of the worst issues and problems that the world has seen, political, economic, social. She championed women in all our complexity. She brought people together, professionally and in friendship, with the expectation that we all could find important critical links to each other, even when we vehemently disagreed. And, not coincidentally, I think she kind of delighted in the sparks, but of course also in the outcomes that occurred. Let me just close that by saying that you didn't have a chance to meet her, but I hope you all have or will have a Bailey in your life. She was a friend, a trusted source of information, a teller of stories that considered and cared about how the world works. All of us need that kind of mentorship, that kind of support, and the passion of people like her. And I'm choking up a bit. Okay. Some of you know me, people on the far sides of the room. Some of you don't. But to both groups, let me suggest one reason why I might have been asked or invited to stand before you today to deliver this lecture. It's a really simple reason. I like telling stories. I like reading stories. I spent my career figuring out why we tell the stories we do and what the impact they have on their audiences, whether the audience is people in the room like you all, or whether it's people around the world. Many of the stories that I care about have to do with what my mother, bless her soul, used to say was death and destruction. People would sort of say, so what does your daughter do? You say, oh, well, she does death and destruction. Yeah, thanks, Mom. But she's right. My career has been writing about human rights and terrorism, disasters, human-computer interaction, which of course can be a dumpster fire, privacy and AI, and of course, media literacy. And many of the projects I'm most proud of have been worked on with some of the folks in this room. Usually we think of stories as kind of lightweight. So I traveled here by train, and I needed a book for the train. So we think of, what's that beach novel? What's that airplane novel? We fanboy for serial stories, right? Game of Thrones, the Marvel Universe, Harry Potter, Ravenclaw, by the way, just putting it out there. But think about it, stories aren't always lightweight. Wherever you're from, think about the origin story of your community, of your country, or the origin story of your family. You meet somebody for the first time. What's the story you tell about your parents, your younger brother, yourself, right? How do those stories intimately influence who you are and what you think you can be or can't be? I'm fascinated by how the stories we tell affect even us as storytellers. How do the stories we tell bind us to our family, to our culture, to our communities, to our politics, policies, in ways that help nurture us, but that also tie us down. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how stories expand us, nudge us to consider what we haven't thought was possible. How can stories help us reach for something more? All right. Well, we all are probably expert on stories, but let me tell you what I think a story is. Very simply, it's a tale of someone doing something for some reason. All right. Pretty basic, right? That someone is either successful or they're not. In our hearing the story, we learn a smidgen, or maybe a great deal. The ideal outcome of stories is not that the plot gets resolved, I would argue. It's that the tale fits the audience. It gives those in the room or those reading the book or watching on a screen something they need, tangible or intangible. Maybe it challenges the status quo. It could give support, solve a problem, raise questions. Many stories are meant to provoke a reaction, a realization, a confession, a protest, a connection. Stories shape how we see the world. If I tell a story about climate change that emphasizes how the seas will rise, people who don't live near a beach maybe don't really feel the urgency. If I tell a story about climate change that emphasizes the rising costs of shifting to renewable energy, then the solutions that occur to people will probably be economic rather than social or cultural. Stories explain a world, but they also can constrain how we think about what's possible. Okay, here's the point I want you to remember. One of the points, all right? Okay. It's possible to change the story. Ask yourself, consider or maybe reconsider the stories you tell, maybe sometimes even without thinking about it, and those you live by. Rather than accept a story as told, especially one that has a bleak ending, consider, how can you change the story? Okay, so I'm going to tell 3 stories. These are kind of lengthy stories. They're true stories, sadly in some cases, this first case. So as I was writing this talk last week, I was I'm American, but I grew up in Europe and I have a house in France. I was at my house in France and I woke up on Friday morning like everybody else. I reached for my phone before I even got out of bed, looked at the headlines, and the headline in the New York Times said, January 6th hearing, day 8. Trump's complete dereliction of his duty. So last Thursday night, I saw it on Friday, last Thursday night in the halls of Congress of the United States, there was a congressional hearing about the attack on the Capitol, January 6th, 2021. Probably you're all familiar with it, but just to recap in a phrase, it was attack on the Capitol and on Congress by militants, far-right groups allied to then President Donald Trump. Now again, if you're not American or frankly you skimmed over those civics lessons, January 6th is sort of a midway point in the American political calendar. It's after the presidential elections in November, but it's before the inauguration of the president who's been elected in later January. And the elections have to be formally certified by Congress. As the New York Times highlighted, the House panel, so in these hearings, painted a detailed picture of how, during this attack on the Capitol, quote, President Trump chose for hours to do nothing. Quote, Trump never reached out to the heads of any law enforcement, the City of Washington, the FBI, the National Guard, the military, to seek help in responding to quell the violence. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, wrote the New York Times, who is the leading military officer in the United States. He's just under the president, who has a title called Commander-in-Chief, expressed to the committee his astonishment. He said, Trump never, he repeated what he had said to President Trump, to the committee. He said, you're the commander-in-chief. You've got an assault going on in the capital of the United States of America. And there's nothing, no call, nothing, zero. The attack started midday, roughly speaking, at 2:24 p.m., height of the attack. The Capitol has been overrun, it's been breached, and the attackers are inside the building. The White House, where Trump was watching television, watching Fox News on television, which was covering this, were talking about how close the rioters were getting to Vice President Mike Pence, the Republican #2 in the US government. Secret Service radio traffic was recording calls from that vice presidential detail of people literally calling their families to say goodbye. They did not think they were going to survive. Trump could have asked the attackers to stand down. And by all accounts, including that of the attackers, they would have listened to him. Part of the radio traffic that was transcribed were two members of what were called the Oath Keepers, who were militia forces. Said one to another, Trump just tweeted, please support our Capitol Police. They're on our side. Do not harm them. Said another Oath Keeper back, that's saying a lot by what he didn't say, by what Trump didn't say. He didn't say not to do anything to the congressman. Some of you may also remember that Trump had, for most of his presidency and even leading up to his presidency, had called the media the quote-unquote enemy of the people, often writing and, screaming in all caps, enemy of the people. On one of the wooden doors to the Capitol, someone carved in, murder the media. In other words, that day, Trump betrayed his oath of office. He turned a love of country from his supporters into a weapon against our Capitol and the Constitution. The oath of office is one sentence long. The presidential oath of office is one sentence long. It says, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Second story. Going back in history. At the close of the American Revolution, okay, we're still in the United States. Third story is not about the United States. At the close of the American Revolution, there was a very dark moment. Everything that the revolution had been fought for, the right to free speech, the right to protest, a democratic government, was about to be lost, but not at the hands of the British, from an internal threat. This is probably a story you weren't taught in elementary school. It all happened on a really bitterly cold day in March 1783. The Continental Army, the army of Americans led by General George Washington, who was to become later the first president of the United States, was encamped outside New York City, which at that point was occupied by the British. The camp was awaiting news on ships coming from Paris, where the peace treaty ending the war was supposed to have been signed. That freezing day, Washington delivered an address to his officers, many of whom had fought beside him for 8 years. Washington had called that meeting of hundreds of officers in the camp in response to anonymous letters that had been circulating. The letters from a quote-unquote fellow soldier, I said, were anonymous, and they threatened that if the Continental Congress, in other words, the acting government of the revolutionary period, did not pay the soldiers their enlistment bonuses and their overdue pay, that they would march to Congress and they would mutiny. The problem was that the Continental Congress didn't have the power to pay the soldiers. It didn't have the power to tax the states, which were kind of technically still colonies. Congress pledged that when the war was over, the peace treaty was signed, that it would pay, but the men didn't believe them. And the anonymous letters circulating in camp said that the soldiers and their officers should suspect the man, meaning Washington, who would advise to more forbearance. In other words, wait, just wait. So let me sum up what's happening. That Monday morning, 1783, George Washington was the only thing that stood between the army of the colonies, the United States, and a mutiny against Congress. If that happened, of course, that would end the American Revolution's dreams to create a democratic civilian government. Remember, they were fighting against the king, right? They were fighting for democracy. They were fighting to govern themselves. Washington had turned 51 3 weeks before. Sounds to be pretty young. But not so much in 1783. He had been aged by 8 years of battle. His eyes were failing. His aides had copied out his speech in a very large hand. That previous week, he had received a pair of bifocals, courtesy of Benjamin Franklin. He had tried them out in privacy, but didn't wear them thinking that it made him look too vulnerable, right? So he walked into that building, Washington walked into the building where hundreds of his officers were assembled with a speech that he had taken hours to write. As Thomas Jefferson later said, the third president of the United States, it was probably the most important speech of Washington's life. According to the many accounts of it that were written by those in the audience, Washington spoke passionately, logically, thoughtfully. His deep blue eyes, which we were told about too, looked down at the pages of his speech and out at the men. And he warned them not to listen to anonymous messages from those who hide who they are, try to forestall other voices from speaking, him, and who call for immediate violence. Who's gonna profit, he essentially said. If men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences that can invite the consideration of mankind, in other words, if we can't talk about maybe going to war, that reason is no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent, we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. And then Washington called in his climatic moment to, let me ask you in the name of the country, as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any specious pretenses, to overturn the liberty of our country, and who wickedly attempts to open the gates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood. Probably sounded a lot better when he said it, right? But there should be a resonance there if we think about the first story I told and the second story I told. Anyway, Washington came to the end of his speech. The men were rumbling on the benches. Of course, it's cold. And Washington believed he had failed. He believed the men in the camp would mutiny out of their anger and frustration, and that blood between Americans would be shed. But he had one more hope. He had received a letter from a congressman from Virginia who had promised his support to the Army. So in other words, there was a friend to the Army on the national government. Washington opened the note, then realized he couldn't read it because the congressman had written in too small handwriting. So he got out his bifocals. Again, this is all written up in accounts of people who were there. The noise in the room increased, and he glanced up apologetically with his glasses on his nose and said, "You must pardon me, I've gone gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." In the letters describing the day, they describe people literally crying in response. They had seen Washington old beyond his years, tired with them, but not faltering in his service to both the Army and to Congress, and to his commitment of the values that the revolution was being fought for. The men stood. It then became clear to Washington and everybody else, they stood with him. They trusted him. There would be no mutiny. Eight years and 9 months later, December 5th, 1791, the right to free speech and freedom of press became US law when Virginia became the 10th of 14 states to ratify the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, including the First Amendment. And with that ratification of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution went into effect. Okay, story 3, short. 4 years ago, July 16th, 2019, I was here at the Academy tweeting out the lecture that was being given for the same lectureship, the Bailey Morris-Eck lecture, by a man named Shaldul Alam. In my tweet, I said, famed photographer Shaldul Alam just said, democracy, or quote, democracy is an elusive entity. It is my job to keep the ember alive. A little less than a year before he was here, on the 5th of August 2018, Alam was taken from his home in Bangladesh, shortly after giving an interview to Al Jazeera and posting live videos on Facebook of government protests in the streets of Dhaka, protesting government corruption sparked by a bus accident. He was arrested by the Dhaka police, imprisoned, and tortured. International groups from around the world called for his release. Amnesty International, PEN International, Mumbai Press Club, Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, all called for his release. After 107 days in November, he was released on bail. Later that year, he was one of many journalists around the globe who were honored by Time magazine in its famous yearly edition Person of the Year, except this time it was People of the Year. Alam came to talk at the Salzburg Academy 8 months after his release from prison. And even when he was here in Salzburg, he was on tenterhooks because he was still awaiting, he was on bail, he was still awaiting the date for his trial in court. What's the lesson of these 3 stories? For me, it's that democracy has always been at risk, from authoritarian leaders who seek power by any means, from military or even ordinary citizens who believe they've been wronged and seek to redress those wrongs by going around the rule of law, from those who profit from corruption and those who believe they have something to gain by undermining the rights of others. There aren't a lot of bulwarks, a lot of walls against all those who would undermine democracy. It can be said pretty simply. The defense of democracy rests on a country's commitment to the rights of all. And those rights must be valued and supported by the citizens and their leaders, and they must be upheld by the country's central institutions of government. Institutions that themselves must act within the rule of law, laws that are founded on democratic principles. Today, as multiple pollsters have repeatedly found, folks around the world are not that happy about the state of democracy. Democracy in their own countries. They like democracy as a governing concept, but as they said to the Pew Research Center, which is a pollster in the United States, surveyor, democracy is not delivering, quote unquote. A 2021 survey of 17 advanced economies, right, mostly in the global north, found that roughly 2/3 or more of those in Italy, Spain, South Korea, Greece, France, Belgium, Japan, the United States say their political system needs major changes or needs to be completely reformed. One reason for those beliefs, according to Pew, many around the world believe that, quote, political and social divisions are amplifying the challenges of contemporary democracy. Okay, think of all the isms that you could think of. Racism, for starters. The surveys did note some good news, however. Instead of turning away from democracy, many want more democracy and a stronger voice in the political system. Matter of fact, the countries polled really high on being interested in direct democracy. In other words, where citizens vote directly on what does or doesn't happen. So, what prompts citizens to value democracy? Okay, well, you've got leaders like George Washington and Abdul Alam, people in government and in media who keep their citizens informed with information the citizens trust. So they're not telling facile, easy stories about heroes and villains, for example. They're telling complicated stories, stories that are hard to hear, stories about process, stories that are true even when the truth is not welcome, and the consequences, not getting paid, are hard. Whom do you trust to tell the story? Actually, that's a quote. It's a quote from Time magazine in that People of the Year issue that I just mentioned, that Alam was mentioned in. The cover story was called The Guardians. Who are the Guardians? Journalists. Journalists at risk, silenced, tortured, killed. Journalists who put their own lives on the line because they believe it's important to tell the news. They believe it's essential for the communities to know the news, even when their own lives are at risk. So Time had different covers, but in all the issues, it mentioned, Shadul Alam mentioned, it highlighted Jamal Khashoggi, highlighted Wallon and Kwasu'u from Myanmar, who later won the Pulitzer Prize for their investigations. 5 reporters from the Capital Gazette in my formerly home state of Maryland who were killed. Mentioned investigative journalist Maria Ressa from the Philippines. She was later awarded, together with Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov, editor, the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize. As the prize committee said about both of them, they were being given the Peace Prize, quote, for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. Four years later, the same question remains pertinent. 4 years later, meaning today, right? Whom do you trust to tell the story? One answer, those who are not acting in self-interest. Mis and disinformation, typically from self-interested parties, adversely affects democratic institutions. We've all seen that play out. Mis and disinformation, we've heard a lot about it coming from government. It's what's roiling both England and the United States right this second, but also comes from corporations. Think of the tobacco industry for many years, for example. Think of the pharmaceutical industry, for instance. Profit incentives often is behind, profit and power incentives are often behind mis and disinformation. As a whistleblower, so a whistleblower is somebody who's from inside a company or institution and then calls them out. As whistleblower from Facebook said to Congress, I believe that Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. The company leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram, both owned by Meta, safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people. You know, we've talked a lot in our world about social media and the problems in social media, but they're not the only bad actor. TV networks, 24-hour talk radio. The problem is there are few incentives for media to serve the public, to be a public service. And there's a lot of incentives for them to get an audience, keep it as long as possible, and then sell the audience data, you guys, to advertisers. But let me segue for a couple of minutes, because you've all heard that before. I don't need to belabor it. But unless you've been taking some STEM courses, some neuroscience courses, you may not have heard this part. It's very often we say, how can these people believe fake stories? How do they get taken in by false information? Especially when that information has been denounced by others. Information about vaccinations, information about whether voter fraud existed. And I would say that it's too easy and oftentimes wrong for us to say that those people who believe the false stories, which can be us sometimes, are either just stupid or they're in thrall to those in power. Right? They've been taken in. One answer to why false stories, narratives, information is so powerful has to do with our neurology. The way we are hardwired to learn has been exploited. There's a couple of ways this happens. One is something that's called confirmation bias. You've probably heard it. I want to mention it, but it's you want to believe things that align with your own cultural, political beliefs, right? You don't want to challenge, if you've been a Democrat your whole life, you don't want to challenge, maybe the Democrats are wrong. So confirmation bias can make you believe something, or make you not question it. Then there's a related phenomenon called expressive responding. And that's when you respond to information, and if you are neutrally asked what's been told to you, or even what's appearing in a photo, you may be able to correctly respond, but if you're told that in a larger political context, you don't. Classic story of expressive responding is people being shown audience drone pictures of the crowds for President Barack Obama's inauguration and President Donald Trump's inauguration. And when people were asked which picture has more people in it, they were able to correctly identify that it was the Obama administration's inauguration that had more people. But when they were asked to say which one was which, they misidentified it according to their political perspective. So in those two cases, confirmation bias and expressive responding, truth can take a backseat to partisanship, right? But then there's more unconscious brain responses. Those conscious confirmation bias, expressive responding, we can learn to overcome, right? If we're media literate, we can learn to overcome those. We can be aware of our own biases. But then there's one that's sort of sub rosa. Neuroscience teaches us that there's, roughly speaking, 3 ways that information moves from short-term memory to long-term memory. One is urgency, one is association, one is repetition. Urgency is when you're threatened, right? You're attacked, you're in a car accident, something dramatic happens, and literally your brain is awash in a release of stress hormones. It strengthens the synaptic connections among the neurons in your head. Your amygdala is jarred into encoding that threat into long-term memory. You're not going to not remember that. Association occurs when you're given a new piece of information, but it already seems part of or aligns with something you already know well. All right? All right, what I want to talk to you about is repetition. Most learning relies on repetition. Depending on what culture you grew up in, you might have gotten more repetition than others, but think of how you learned the multiplication tables, perhaps how you learned your scales in piano. The power of repetition is also why it's so hard to make a behavioral change, because not only do you have to repeat the new behavior, but you have to not do the old behavior, you know, getting that tub of ice cream out of the fridge when you're a little depressed, right? But according to cognitive research journals, repetition can affect beliefs about truth. People perceive claims as truer if they've been exposed to them before. This is known as the illusory truth effect. I'm quoting, repeated exposure can significantly affect people's beliefs about the world, has been noted in scholars across fields. In particular, still quoting, repetition increases belief in false information, even when the misinformation contradicts prior knowledge. Studies have also shown that You don't have to be told 3 times in an hour to believe it. It could be 3 times in 3 days, or 3 times in 3 weeks, or even over a period of years. The repetition causes you to believe something. Even if there are caveats that are expressed at the same time, like, this source may not be right, but, and then they tell you the false information. Why is there this effect? Well, again, let's go back to the scientists. They say there's something about our brain, it's called processing fluency. If it's easy for us to learn something, then we tend to think it's true. So if any of you guys are going into design, and I know some of my colleagues before have already talked to you about some design challenges. If you go into design, you want to make your fonts, you want to make white space, you want to make your pages as clean and clear as possible because people will believe it. Easy to understand speeches, telling stories, short words, pauses. Making something easy to understand also causes you to think it's true, right? And the same thing happens with repetition. So how does this relate to stories? Well, since I've introduced medicine, there's a discipline within medical education called narrative medicine. So it's a course, depending on what med school you may be going to, it's either a course or a series of courses where students read works about being a doctor, often written by doctors. So people like Oliver Sacks, William Carlos William, Anton Chekhov, as well as works by writers who have written about medicine, Shakespeare, for example. And most recently added to the curriculum are memoirs and so forth by patients who, instead of talking about what it's like to be the surgeon at the operating table, are talking what it's like to be on the operating table, right? But narrative medicine is intended and was brought into medical school curriculum to teach medical students empathy, to recognize that the next door they open in the hospital is going to have a person inside, not just a patient. Okay, so those of us who aren't going to be doctors in this room, we all nod our heads and say, well, like, duh, that's so obvious. Of course, there's going to be a person inside there. But, you know, we do that too. We dismiss others who aren't like us. We revile those who don't think the way we do. We pity those people who are too stupid to know that they're wrong. Those are the stories we tell ourselves. But such stories are not helpful to our getting to a good outcome of better health, of a more equal society, of a more survivable climate, of a healthy democracy. In this week's New Yorker, those of you who get it, it's July 25th version, Dr. Jerome Groopman quotes the chief of pediatric surgeon in Vanderbilt, top medical school in the south of the United States, who writes, "Telling stories about the things that most affect us is a redemptive act and will help us all in the push to heal." Let me highlight that last phrase. Stories will help us all in the push to heal. Healing's, I think, a really marvelous word. I love it because it both acknowledges that we have wounds, that we're hurting, and it gives us hope that there's an afterplace to that hurt, right? We can be healed. We, of course, think about doctors and nurses and first responders as the ones who are in the healing arts. But let me say this. Okay, pause. We are all in the healing arts. 20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt borrowed the phrase amor mundi, Latin, means love of the world, from St. Augustine. Arendt grew up in the Holocaust era. Her career straddled World War II, and she repeatedly wrestled in her books with the question of why we succumb to and normalize evil. She came to identify tyranny. And remember that tyranny is the opposite of democracy. You know, if you go into a thesaurus and you do opposites, right, antonyms, tyranny does not equal democracy. So she came to identify the root of tyranny as, quote, the act of making other human beings irrelevant. We do that too often, especially when we think about huge crises in this world. As another great intellectual of the 20th century, James Baldwin, prosaically reminded us, we've got to be as clear-headed about human beings as possible, because we're still each other's only hope. You perhaps know the apocryphal story of the brilliant inventor Archimedes, the most brilliant mathematician of the ancient world, and many would say of all time. He wrote the mathematical proof on levers, you know, seesaws, levers. And that caused him to remark, according to the classical authors writing roughly in that time, give me a place to stand in my lever, and I can move the world. So we all have to find that powerful place to stand, to practice what I'm calling now our own healing arts. To start, we must recognize that there are problems. A problem large enough to care about, but one that has a small, maybe even tiny opening for us to It's not only possible to start small if we want to heal the world, we have to start small. I don't know if you've been noticing that I've got, black and blue marks up here. I broke my shoulder exactly 3 weeks ago. Cracked some ribs, went flying when I, nice, huh? Went flying as I was running, on a run. The very first exercise that you're to do if you break your shoulder, it's to shrug your shoulders, to learn how to shrug your shoulders again. Weird, How could you not shrug your shoulders? Well, you can't. We feel stymied by the scale of the world's problems, but as Shahidul Alam said 4 years ago, democracy is an elusive entity. It's my job to keep the ember alive. All right, let's parse that for just a quick second. He didn't say it's my job to start the fire. He didn't say it's my job to bring everybody around the fire, to feel the heat. He's claiming for his task to keep the ember, one ember, alive. When a crisis is huge, we feel stymied. Aid agencies know this very well. Really big crisis somewhere, nobody gives any money. Politicians cynically count on this. Democracy flounders abroad and at home because huge problems are abstract problems and nobody feels like they can own it. Nobody feels like they can make a difference. So I make charge that at least for you guys in this room here at the Academy, you rebrand what has to happen and call what is needed healing. When just said by itself, healing kind of sounds soft, doesn't sound sufficient in strength to counter things like the rise of authoritarianism, nationalism, racism, all the isms in the world. But then really think about what the healing arts do. Healing doesn't just mean that the patient lies in the bed hoping that time will make everything better. Had I done that, I literally wouldn't be here, right? In 3 weeks, you're supposed to be still wearing 100% of the time the sling, right? I would be nursing my broken shoulder, and it turns out ribs are even worse. When you lie down, you can't breathe, and there's a real threat of dying from pneumonia, from a broken shoulder and broken ribs, whatever. Not daring to lie down, but healing is painful. It's an active, not a passive process. Let's go back to medicine for a quick second, and I'm almost done. When a situation is dire and a surgeon is called in, here's what happens. The surgeon listens to the patient. The patient tells her history. She collects as much additional data as possible. She does her own research. She confirms what she thinks is wrong. She goes into the operating room. She cuts the patient. She determines what specifically the problem is again. And most importantly, what she has the skills to do. After that, the patient is sewn back up, often slightly internally reconfigured. If all has gone well, it's up to the patient to commit to the work of recovery. Okay, hospitals search help, but that may take weeks, months, even years. And often if the patient doesn't want the problem to reoccur, the patient has to make some alterations. Maybe exercise more, maybe diet. Maybe they have to change how they're working or how they socialize. The patient may never be perfect, but a great outcome is that the patient can walk again, or in my case, I can raise this arm, and I'm up to about here on this one. But that's big. I can now comb back my head. We need healing in this world, and I believe that starts by us tending to our democracy. So let's think about reframing change stories, particularly big change stories, into healing stories, active healing stories. Remember Shahidul Alam's single ember of democracy. What's the small thing that may lead to bigger things that you can commit to? How can you start to heal your corner of the world? I want to end with one last quote, of course. Another Salzburg fellow who came here when she was 24, who decided to do one small thing after being here. Her name is Stacey Abrams, and I hope one day she becomes president of the United States, but at the moment she's running for the governorship of the state of Georgia. She said, "I understood from the very beginning that the right to vote undergirds every other right we hold to be true and valuable. But what really solidified it for me was when I was 24. I was part of an international program called the Salzburg Seminar. I worked with a young woman from Colombia and a young man from Sierra Leone. The young man from Sierra Leone had been a forced fighter, conscripted, and he not only escaped but helped create an entire organization to help lost boys come back into the community. And she was from Colombia. Her family had tried to flee, but they were on the wrong side of the rebels." I'm still quoting. "And watching how hard they were fighting just for the notion of democracy. And then watching our country, meaning the United States, which had democracy, but it wasn't fully realized, rekindled in me the responsibility of moving this forward." And Stacey Abrams, since she was 24, that's what she's done. And if you watch that 3-minute 75th anniversary video, which I think maybe Ben showed, you've seen Stacey Abrams in that. Thanks so much for listening to me. I really appreciate it.